Good day. Today is Saturday, 19th July 2025, and as of today, we've had news of another massive missile and drone attack by Russia at various targets in Ukraine. Apparently, these targets were spread out across Ukraine. One particular major target was the city of Pavlograd, which is located to the west of Pokrovsk. It's widely assumed that it's a major center of supplies for the garrison in Pokrovsk. It was particularly struck by drones and missiles. Other drones and missiles launched by Russia hit targets in Odessa and in other cities. The Russian Defense Ministry has not yet provided us with a detailed account of the attacks, but it does seem that these attacks are now escalating and that they continue much in the way that they have been doing for some time now across the entirety of Ukraine. The Ukrainians, incidentally, continue to make extraordinary claims about the numbers of drones and sometimes missiles that they shoot down. I've not been able to keep track of their latest claims, but I understand that they claim to have shot down practically everything. The pictures and photos of the damage that I have seen already in places like Odessa argue against this. There's been no film or footage or pictures of any kind shown from Pavlograd, perhaps the epicenter of the attack. To be frank, as far as I'm concerned, Ukrainian claims to be shooting down drones, nearly all the drones and most of the missiles, increasingly lack credibility. Now, the other thing is that from what one senses, from what I can sense, the situation on the actual front lines, particularly in the Pakaros and Konstantinovka areas, which are the center of gravity, if you will, of the ongoing Russian offensive, that the situation there is intensifying, that the Russians are pushing harder and harder. They captured apparently a village called Popov Yar about a day ago, but there are widespread assumptions that they are making further inroads. Both sides, both the Ukrainians and the Russians, are tightening the information flow from the battlefronts. This is often the case when battles reach their intensity. But perhaps the best guide as to the current direction of events, especially in the Pokrovsk area, is coming from commentaries provided by Ukrainian soldiers, some of which are appearing on the internet and in Telegram channels. And the overall mood is dire. They seem to be saying that the pressure from the Russians is intensifying all the time, that there are just too many Russians, that there are too many weapons, too many tanks, armored vehicles, too many shells, too much of everything for the Ukrainians to be able to hold them back, and that the Ukrainian lines are simply not holding. There are also reports from the Ukrainians themselves about the situation in Novoekonomichny, the village immediately to the west of Pokrovsk, of Pokrovsk Mirnograd, which the Russians broke into, both from the south and from the north, some days ago. And again, the sense that I get from what some of these commentators, these Ukrainian commentators, are saying, is that the situation in Novoekonomichny is critical. And again, that it looks as if the Ukrainians are simply unable to hold their positions there. There is a general consensus starting to develop amongst the, I should say, more reliable commentators, that we are looking at a we're approaching, if you like, a crisis point in this battle for Pokrovsk. It's probably just days away. We could see a sudden collapse. The pressure is just too strong, and the Ukrainians are finding it impossible to hold their positions. I recall previous battles of a roughly similar kind. Bakhmut in 2023, Avdiivka in 2024. I have never come across such a gloomy mood on the part of Ukrainian commentators as the one that I am seeing now. So anyway, that's what I want to say about the military situation. Apparently in the Konstantinovka area, the situation for the Ukrainians is almost as bad. There are reports that they've evacuated that village of Sherbinovka, west of Toretsk and south of Konstantinovka, that the important village of Yablunovka is about to be captured in its entirety by the Russians, that the Ukrainians are holding on only to some positions in the east of this village. And Group of Forces North is now giving us more and more reports about the situation in Volchansk. There's no doubt now that the Russians have indeed crossed the Volcha River and that the fighting has moved from northern Volchansk to southern Volchansk. It looks as if the Russians have captured most or perhaps all of the industrial zone of Volchansk, which is located south of the Volcha River. As I understand it, the residential areas, including the high-rise residential areas, were mainly north of the Volcha River, but south of the Volcha River was where the industrial plants, the factories and the workshops were located. It seems as if the entire north of Volchansk is now under Russian control, and that, as I said, that the Russians perhaps control either most or all of the industrial district to the south, in which case it seems to me that the Battle of Volchansk itself is definitely gradually coming to an end. And speaking of the reports from Group of Forces North about Volchansk, they seem to be becoming increasingly optimistic. So we could see the Russian offensive intensifying, and there's no reason to think that we have yet reached the high point. The major reserves have not yet been committed. The two reserve armies have still not joined the battle. One senses that, as I said, the situation is cracking, but we are far from the culminating or peak point in this offensive. That is still to come. Incidentally, I've also seen some suggest that the offensive will continue until roughly October, that it will be focused mainly in the summer. Well, that may be true, but the offensive, the Russian offensive that took place last year, as I remember, continued well into the autumn months. It was in autumn, for example, in October, that Ugledar fell, and Kurakovo fell, as I remember, somewhat later. And going back further still, my further memory is that Yavdeevka in the previously actually fell in February 2024. There is no reason to assume, it seems to me, that simply because the hot weather will end in the summer, that Russian offensive will end as well. So anyway, I started with this quick military rundown of the situation, because to be absolutely clear, in terms of geopolitics, in terms of the shaping of international relations, this remains the key to understanding everything else. It's the pivot point in international relations. It's what has led to the deepening of the relationship between China and Russia. It's led to the crystallization of the BRICS states. It's led to the alienation of much of the global south from the West. It's what is now leading to the development of the new payment and currency arrangements that the BRICS are working upon and are preparing. And here, by the way, I should say that the President of the United States, Donald Trump, has recently made comments congratulating himself, as he so often does, on his enormous and spectacular success in supposedly destroying the BRICS. He says that he's a threat to impose tariffs, deterred countries from attending the BRICS conference in Brazil, and that BRICS is, in effect, yesterday's story. I think that is complacent to the point of being delusional. On the contrary, it seems to me that events are moving forward, in fact, faster, if anything. China is close now, it seems, to launching its digital RMB. The Russians have been doing further programs and development on their digital ruble. They've deferred launch of that until next year, but clearly it's coming, and I've seen the sort of plans that they have for it, and they're becoming increasingly elaborated. Again, it seems to me that Donald Trump, because his emphasis is so much on the dollar, hasn't fully understood that the BRICS are not seeking to replace the dollar. Rather, they're seeking to bypass it. And I'm not going to discuss that in detail in this program. That would require a whole program in itself. But they're seeking to bypass the dollar by setting payment and other arrangements to circumvent it. And this is accelerating. And of course, the recent steps that he's been taking, the tariffs that he's been imposing on more and more countries, the retaliatory tariffs that he has been experimenting with since March, his latest threats to impose tariffs, 100% tariffs on countries that trade with Russia, unless there is a deal done within 50 days. Well, all of that, of course, is accelerating the momentum towards the establishment of these alternative finance and payment arrangements. And I don't get the sense that there's any change of momentum there. In fact, perhaps the big news in terms of BRICS is that India and China, after a moment of coolness following the Indo-Pakistani conflict, now seem to be working very hard to patch things up and to get their relationship back on track. I said at the time of the BRICS summit in Brazil that it seemed to me that one of the reasons, maybe the primary reason, why Xi Jinping did not go to Brazil was because he did not want to meet Modi, the Indian Prime Minister, one-to-one without Putin being there at a time when relations between India and China were strained. I understand that exactly the same point has been made widely in Chinese social media. We see that this has worked out, that the reduction in contacts at the highest level between India and China has enabled the officials of these two countries to meet and to work things out quietly without attracting too much attention. And it does look as if, as I said, the relationship between India and China is again back on track. The nature of the relationship, the fact that India and China continue to have their territorial disputes and their other disputes, the fact that they're the two Asian giants and that they will be looking at each other warily, means that this will always be a complicated relationship and a difficult one to navigate, but they always, in the end, manage to pull it together and to keep the BRICS operation, to which they are both, for compelling reasons of self-interest, committed to keep the BRICS operation back on track. And of course, if Donald Trump, if the United States are unwise enough to roll out the 100% tariffs on China and India, that Donald Trump is threatening, in light of threatening if the Russians don't come to some kind of agreement within the next, well, it'll be, I think, about 43 days now. Well, if that doesn't happen, if Trump is unwise enough to impose those kind of tariffs, then of course the momentum of improvement in the relations between India and China is simply going to accelerate. For the record, so far as I can see, instead of India and Russia reducing their contacts, their economic contacts seem to be increasing. There are reports in the Russian media that India has put in requests to Russia for more exports by Russia to India of fertilizer, presumably because this is more needed in India than it was previously. So anyway, that's the overall situation. That is the overall picture that I can see. An intensifying Russian offensive in Ukraine. The Ukrainians straining every nerve to try to contain it, but finding it increasingly difficult to do so. And the Russians have still not landed their big punch. In fact, there are reports in Russia that the military have told Putin, advised Putin, that if he gives the word, Russia now has a sufficient accumulation of forces to end the conflict in 2 months, and that there's even some frustration that for the moment at least, Putin is resisting those requests from the military. I will here state my own view. I don't believe these reports. I think that they do come indeed from Russia, but I don't think they actually reflect the discussions between the political leadership, in other words Putin, and the Russian General Staff. I believe that some time ago, Putin in effect gave the General Staff a green light to conduct the war in Ukraine the way it thought best, and the Russian General Staff has conducted it in the way that it always does, systematically and methodically, building up reserves, shaping the battlefield, grinding down the enemy, preparing for that moment when it can unleash its reserves to maximum effect. And there's other reports, which I've also seen, that Donald Trump supposedly, when he gave the 50-day deadline, was signaling to Putin that he wanted the war in Ukraine to be ended in 50 days. I don't believe that is true. I think that what Donald Trump was doing was simply giving himself the summer before he had to deal with Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal in the autumn. 50 days covers the period when Congress is in recess, just saying. and when Blumenthal and Graham are not therefore in a position to push forward with their bone-crushing sanctions bill, I think that is all there is to it. And I don't believe that the Russians expect or intend to end the whole war within just 50 days. That's my own personal view. Now, there is an awful lot more that can be said about the situation. I understand that Australia has announced that it's now going to provide Ukraine with 49 more Abrams tanks. That's more than the United States allegedly provided, which was 31. Reportedly, there are only 2 of those tanks from that batch of 31 left. They were delivered to Ukraine around a year ago, as I remember, in the aftermath, and they started to appear in the aftermath of the fall of Avdiivka. They haven't lasted very long. The Russians have burnt through them at extraordinary speed, and several of them are now mementos in Russian victory parks and museums, and others are being examined and pored over by Russian technicians, with the information about them being provided to the Chinese and to other Russian allies. Just saying. So that's another 49 of these tanks likely to go down the drain. Given that the Russians are now producing around 1,500 tanks a year, of which around 300 tanks are modern T-90Ms, this really isn't going to change the dynamics of the battlefield at all. They will, I suspect, however, cause alarm amongst some people in the United States. There are reports that Elbridge Colby, the US Assistant Secretary of Defense, has apparently contacted US allies in the Asia-Pacific, including, I suspect, Australia, but including South Korea and Japan, asking them basically what plans they have in case there is a war between them and China. Now, I should say that in Europe, Elbridge Colby is seen as some kind of a American isolationist. He's known to be somebody who believes that the war in Ukraine was for the United States, a shocking waste and misallocation of resources. He is somebody who clearly does not believe that the United States should be investing more weapons and supplies in Ukraine, because the focus is, for him, overridingly and exclusively on China. Now, that has led some people who are focused more on the Ukraine conflict and on the Ukraine war to see Elbridge Colby as some kind of moderate or realist or some kind of thing. In China, he is viewed profoundly differently. I would say that in the Chinese view, he fulfills a similar role in terms of antagonism to China that in the Russian view Victoria Nuland used to fulfill in terms of antagonism towards Russia. He is most emphatically not someone that the Chinese appreciate or have any time for at all. They certainly do not consider him as a moderate. On the contrary, I don't think it's an overstatement to say that some people in China see Elbridge Colby as more warmonger in chief than anything else. So anyway, that is the Chinese view of Elbridge Colby. The point is that the United States is contacting its allies and is now seriously talking about conflict with China. And if it is doing that, even as one of its Asian allies, Australia, is shipping tanks, of which Australia cannot have vast numbers, American supplied tanks, to Ukraine. And we can see how, from Elbridge Colby's point of view, what a disaster, what a massive diversion of resources the conflict in Ukraine continues to be. Because here is an Asian ally of the United States, or at least an Indo-Pacific ally of the United States, which is to say Australia, a key ally, one of the most important allies the United States has in the Indo-Pacific. And instead of husbanding its resources and focusing them against China, the major adversary in the Indo-Pacific, presumably at the instigation of others within the political leadership of the United States and of Australia, Australia, instead of husbanding its resources, is diverting resources to the urgent crisis, the crisis which is dominating the media cycle, and where the crisis is deepening, and that is Ukraine instead. Even Australia, Colby must be thinking, is shipping weapons to Ukraine, whereas of course it should be shipping or maintaining its weapons in Australia and in the Indo-Pacific region. Now this of course speaks again of the crisis, the resource crisis, that the United States and its allies are increasingly facing. The United States unable to keep up with China in terms of shipbuilding. China's shipbuilding industry is able to produce ships at hundreds of times, literally, the rate that the United States can. Its fleet is burgeoning and growing in strength. The Biden era AUKUS idea, in which apparently Colby himself had a part, the idea of Britain and the United States supplying nuclear submarines to Australia, causing the Australians to scrap their earlier plan to buy conventional submarines from France. Anyway, that plan is now in crisis. The United States cannot produce the nuclear submarines, nor of course can Britain, the nuclear submarines that Australia was expecting. It needs all the submarines it can produce for itself. There's talk that AUKUS, the delivery of the submarines, is going to be delayed until the 2040s, in other words, 20 years from now. And there's even some talk that the entire AUKUS arrangement, which the Biden administration unrolled with such fanfare and which caused such anger in France and such delusional hope in Australia, that whole project might have to be cancelled entirely. I spoke about, at the beginning of this program, about how the military crisis in Ukraine is reshaping the entire system of international relations. And we can see its effects now, even in terms of the military balance in the Indo-Pacific region. The United States, its allies, having to pull resources even from the places where it wants to concentrate them, because of the crisis it faces, the military crisis it faces, its allies are facing in Ukraine. And you can also see this in some of the incredible, wild statements that are coming from some American officials. General Donahue, one of the US military commanders in Europe, in fact, I believe that he is an important ground forces commander. He's spoken grandly and with the bravado that unfortunately American generals are often prone to. Sharp contrast, by the way, to the silence that Russian and Chinese generals invariably show. Anyway, General Donahue has spoken about how, in the event of a crisis in Europe, the United States would be able to overrun the Kaliningrad Oblast, Russia's Kaliningrad Oblast, at incredible speed, much faster than the Russians could possibly expect or imagine. Well, first, a few things to say about this. First of all, General Donahue himself is a Special Forces officer, apparently. His background is in US Special Forces. There was, interestingly enough, a few days ago, a very interesting article in Responsible Statecraft, the website of the Quincy Institute, written by a former US Special Forces soldier, saying that the US Special Forces now have an excessive degree of importance within the US military structures, that they have, because they've been relatively successful over the past 25 years, since the so-called War on Terror began, they have achieved an unhealthy degree of preeminence within the American military system. And it seems to me that General Donahue's comments basically reflect this, because Special Forces no doubt can achieve a great deal, but capturing Kaliningrad, defended by a force of 12,000 Russian infantry, backed by apparently 1,200 Russian Marines, and a territory in which the Russians are known to have pre-positioned nuclear weapons. I think that talking in that way about Kaliningrad is reckless, to say the least. The reality is that the United States is desperately short of men and machines and weapons in Europe. There are multiple commentaries that confirm this. The US does have a powerful air force in Europe, and Kaliningrad, which is some distance from the rest of the Russian mainland and cut off potentially by the Baltic states, would be vulnerable to air attack in that way. But then Kaliningrad does have its own air defenses and its own offensive missile defenses. And of course, with the Oreshniks and other missiles coming into service with the Russian military, and with powerful Russian reserve armies being created in the Baltics, in the area of the Baltics, and with Belarus now firmly aligned with Russia, it would not, of course, be so simple. My own sense is that the reason General Donahue is talking in this grandiose way is because he, like all other American generals and military officials, is aware of the rapidly deteriorating situation, in fact, the catastrophically deteriorating situation in Ukraine. And he is also aware of how threats to Russian merchant shipping in the Baltic Sea is causing the Russian Baltic fleet to start taking steps to provide convoy support for Russian and for Russian and other merchant ships that continue to trade with Russia and which transit the Baltic. So, though the comment was threatening and is being treated by the Russians as being so, I see it more as a sign of weakness than of strength. If the United States really did feel confident about the situation in Europe and in the Baltics, would an American general really be talking in the way the General Donahue has just done? That's, anyway, my own take. General Donahue, by the way, is not the only senior NATO officer who has been active. Admiral Radicanin, essentially he fulfills the chief of staff role in the British military, though Britain, like the United States, does not have a general staff system in the way that Russia does. Anyway, Admiral Radicanin has also rushed to Kiev, where he's apparently meeting with Ukrainian officials, military officials. Now, Britain is in a difficult position because it is no longer able to supply large numbers of key weapons to Ukraine. It has no air defense systems that it can send any further. The Challenger 2 tanks that were sent by Britain to Ukraine proved a complete failure. We don't hear about them very much anymore. My sense is that those that have survived have been relocated to the rear, but we're not seeing them on the battlefronts much any longer. They were used briefly, as I remember, in Ukraine's 2023 Zaporozhye offensive, when at least one was destroyed, and they were also used during the Kursk offensive as well, which ended in catastrophic failure. But anyway, whatever. The military, the military supplies that Britain can afford to send to Ukraine are now strictly limited, presumably possibly to light weapons. Artillery has already been sent. Armour cannot be sent in quantity anymore. The British military is itself in a dire state and is not any longer able to do very much. Now, there's a lot of speculation that the British, who did play a seminal role, as the London Times recently disclosed, in organising and leading Ukraine's summer 2023 offensive, and who were instrumental in pressuring Ukraine to conduct its disastrous Krinky offensive in the autumn of 2023 and the winter of 2024, that the British are going to Ukraine to try to organise a new Ukrainian offensive. And it's also been suggested that, and this comes from the Washington Post now mostly, that what Donald Trump was trying to do when he spoke to Zelensky on the 4th of July was trying to get Zelensky to think offensively, to launch his own attacks against Russia, and that this is all now being put together, and there is speculation that the Ukrainians might be planning some new offensive in some location somewhere on the battlefronts, and that Radakin has gone to Kiev in order to prepare for that. Well, such possibilities can never be excluded. Zelensky has always shown that he wants to be on the offensive rather than on the defensive. And this is also, of course, the sentiment of some Western military officers as well. but I'm going to express my own skepticism here. Firstly, we've heard so many different and contrasting accounts about Trump's conversation with Zelensky on the 4th of July that it's difficult to keep up with what all of these various different accounts say. But my own understanding of that telephone conversation is that it was triggered by the Pentagon's earlier pause of US military supplies to Ukraine. Trump found himself under a lot of pressure from Ukraine supporters in the United States. He was also very alarmed by the progress of Richard Blumenthal and Lindsey Graham's bone-crushing sanctions bill. He spoke to Putin on the 3rd of July, trying to get Putin again to agree to a ceasefire, pointing out that the United States was no longer supplying certain key types of weapons to Ukraine. He threatened Putin with sanctions and tariffs and all of those things. He was deeply frustrated when Putin refused. And on the following day, he telephoned Zelensky and Merz. And the main point over the course of these calls was to explain to Zelensky and Merz that the United States was no longer in a position to keep supplying Ukraine with Patriot missile interceptors and to try to cook up this plan, which we've discussed at such inordinate length in so many programs, the plan to have the Europeans buy from the United States future weapons that would be sent to Ukraine and to have the supply of those weapons laundered through NATO. And along the way, Trump, as he often does, said things that I think he's probably already come to regret. He seemed to be egging Zelensky to conduct missile strikes at Moscow without perhaps thinking through the implications. Zelensky apparently told Trump that he would conduct those missile strikes against Moscow if the United States gave him the offensive weapons to do it. My guess, and it's only a guess because of course I wasn't party to the call, is that Zelensky then repeated a request that the Ukrainians have made on many occasions for long-range offensive missiles to strike at Moscow, and mentioned the Tomahawks. Trump very unwisely appears to have agreed to supply offensive missiles to Ukraine because he couldn't supply the air defense missiles. And then after that conversation, when it became clear to the Pentagon that Trump and other officials in the United States were thinking of acceding to the Ukrainian request to supply JASSM's missiles and Tomahawk cruise missiles to strike at Moscow, and pushed back against this incredibly dangerous and reckless plan, that Trump himself pulled back. That is my own understanding of what took place over the course of that call. So I don't think that Trump seriously intended to get the Ukrainians to launch offensives. I think a lot of the things that he said over the course of this conversation have probably been elaborated and taken further than Trump intended. And to be said frankly, I think now, given the collapse in March of Ukraine's Kursk offensive and the devastating losses and disaster that caused to Ukraine, and given the crisis the Ukrainians are facing on the battlefronts in Pokrovsk and Konstantinovka and in Donbass generally. I think that speculating about offensives is unwise, and I cannot imagine that Admiral Radicanin is really there in Ukraine to talk about that. It is not impossible that the Ukrainians might decide to launch an offensive. Ukraine faced an operational crisis in the summer of last year. As I remember, the Russians were pushing westwards from Avdiivka. They were moving closer to Pokrovsk. They eventually captured Ugleda, Selidovo, and Kurachovo, and found themselves in positions to the west of Pokrovsk itself. Zelensky nonetheless diverted forces to the north and launched his ill-starred and disastrous Kursk offensive, whilst denuding troops, Ukrainian troops, in the key Donbass front lines of the men and supplies that they needed to try to hold the Russians back. So it's not impossible that Zelensky might do the same thing. But I don't believe that it is to organize that kind of offensive that Radakin has gone to Kiev. Ukrainian sources like Deep State have been saying increasingly recently that the military situation is worse than is being publicly admitted. Ukrainian commentators are increasingly saying that too. And I suspect that the real reason why Radakin has gone to Kiev is because he wants to find out from the Ukrainians, from Syrsky and the others, and Zelensky, of course, what is really going on. And he's also going there in order to establish some kind of contact with the new Ukrainian defense minister, Shmyhal, the former prime minister. Now that brings me to the political situation in Kiev itself. Seymour Hersh has written another of his articles in which he now talks about a plot supposedly underway, hatched in Washington to remove Zelensky. That Zelensky has overstayed his time as far as the Americans are concerned, that he has been told this by US officials and by the Trump White House. They want him out, and the purpose of this is to replace him with General Zelensky, who is currently in London. And the reshuffle that has taken place in Kiev, the sacking of Umerov as defense minister, his replacement by Shmyhal, Shmyhal's replacement by Sidorenko, the new prime minister who is a close political ally of Yermak, and therefore by extension of Zelensky himself. All of that supposedly is intended to somehow prevent this coup plan by the Trump White House in Kiev being executed. I have to say I am deeply skeptical about all of this, and I'm going to say straight away that there are further reasons beyond Zelensky's own position that makes me skeptical. Firstly, if we go back to Seymour Hersh's article, as well as claiming that the situation in Kiev is now ripe for a coup, which is being organized by the Trump White House, it also claims that Zelensky continues to be in regular contact with General Gerasimov, the chief of Russia's general staff and the overall commander of Russian forces in fighting in this area of the special military operation. Um, Seymour Hersh has been claiming that there's some kind of a dialogue underway between Zelensky and Gerasimov since I think the autumn of 2023. I have not seen a single scintilla of evidence outside what Seymour Hersh himself has been writing that is true. I cannot imagine that Putin would tolerate a dialogue of that kind by his senior military chief and by Ukraine's former military chief. I think that if anything like that actually was happening, I think that Gerasimov would very quickly find himself out of a job. I've seen no evidence of such a dialogue. It is completely at odds with the entire diplomatic process that the Russians have been working upon and have launched, the one which has resulted in the various meetings between the Ukrainians and the Russians in Istanbul. And as I have pointed out, the military are now heavily represented in the Russian delegation that meets with the Ukrainians in Istanbul. Admittedly, these are military intelligence officers, but they are people who are ultimately subordinate directly to Gerasimov himself. So already I have serious doubts about this whole article because, as I said, he continues to make that very, very astonishing claim. I frankly am troubled that Seymour Hersh clings to this belief that there is this communication between Gerasimov and Zelensky. Zelensky, of course, is in London, just to say. So if there was such a communication, the British would presumably be picking up on it. And one wonders how they would feel about it. But it troubles me that Seymour Hersh clings to this belief, despite, as I said, the fact that there is no evidence for it outside that which he is presumably being provided by his sources. And his sources are telling him other things, which astonish me. First of all, they're claiming that Russian casualties in Ukraine are not 1 million, which is the figure the Pentagon is coming up with, and the Ukrainians are coming up with. It's really closer to 2 million. Again, this is completely at odds with the observable facts. That it is completely at odds, for example, with the information provided by Mediazona. I have my own doubts now about Mediazona, but they are putting total Russian deaths at 115,000, rather observed Russian deaths based on actual data, and that is irreconcilable with this number that Seymour Hersh is producing. And of course, he's also saying that the Russian summer offensive that is currently underway has been a dismal failure. He ignores the collapse of the Ukrainian forces in Kursk region, and, well, he's obviously not up to date with the actual situation on the battlefronts. I've already discussed how the Ukrainian channels are on the contrary, in deep despair about it. So I'm afraid I simply don't go along with this information that Seymour Hersh is providing us based on whatever information his sources are giving him. It seems to me that his source is probably culling information from the media, reports about the reshuffle in Kiev, which Hersh refers to in his article, probably are what have triggered the claims about this plan. by the Trump White House to remove Zelensky. The Gerasimov Zelensky discussions, as I said, have been repeated. That story has been repeated for over a year. And the reports about casualties, the massive Russian casualties, and the ongoing failure of the Russian offensive are again things that you will find in many articles in the media as well. To me, as I said, it looks to me as if most of this information is coming from the media. As I said, I don't know who the source that Seymour Hersh is speaking to is, but I doubt that he or she is especially well informed. So I'm afraid I don't see any evidence that there is a plot underway to overthrow Zelensky at the moment. I don't see any sign of this whatsoever. For the record, despite the crisis, the gathering crisis on the front lines, it seems to me that Zelensky remains firmly in control. There have been articles in The Spectator, in the Financial Times, in The Guardian that speak of the despair that many Ukrainians feel about Zelensky and the fact that the population is turning against him. But he controls all of the levers of power, or at least Yermak, his chief of staff, does. And I can't really see how his replacement can be organised at this time. And I have to say that if an attempt were made to remove Zelensky at this time, given how fragile the situation is becoming, it might very well precipitate intense infighting in Kiev, which could accelerate the process of collapse, which, according to these Ukrainian reports that I discussed earlier in the programme, we're now starting to see. So, there it is. I think that there is little chance of any fundamental change. I cannot myself see any change. Radakin is going to Kiev, it seems to me, not to organise Zelensky's removal or anything of that kind, but to try to work out whether the situation is indeed as bad as some of the reports are saying, to see what Shmyhal is going to do as defence minister, to see whether anything can be rescued from this wreckage, and perhaps also to discuss whether that retreat to the defence lines that are apparently being created east of the cities of Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka, whether the time has come to start thinking about putting that plan into effect. By the way, there's been increasing commentaries about this, both in the Russian media and elsewhere. It seems that the Ukrainians are indeed frantically trying to create exactly such a defence line. Well, there it is. I've spent a lot of this programme describing the situation in Ukraine at the present time. It seems to me that, as I said, the deterioration is accelerating. And to say it again, we are not yet at the peak point in the Russian offensive. Far from it. It's a misconception that we're only halfway through it. As I said, last year's offensive continued right up until about December, the end of the year. And if we're talking about the previous year, 2024, the Russian offensive then began in the autumn and continued, well, continuously throughout the winter and the spring and the summer, with Avdiivka falling in February and the Russian advance accelerating later in the spring. So anyway, There it is. That is the situation, as far as I can see, on the battlefronts at the moment. Now, in Russia itself, there is most discussion about the economy and about the economic situation. Alex Christoforou and I have done a program discussing the state of the Russian economy in detail on the Duran, which, if you want to know my own views about the state of the Russian economy, well, you will find it there. Suffice to say that the Russian Central Bank has now published a long analysis of the current price dynamics in Russia. It says that actual inflation in Russia has now fallen to 4%. The current headline annualized figure of 9.3% is backward looking. It still incorporates price rises that have taken place over the last 12 months. Over the last month, which is to say June, prices declined sharply and may have reached the 4% level, which is the central bank's target level. In August, prices in Russia sometimes actually fall because more food becomes available because of the harvest. Sometimes they rise, but at a much lower level. Over the course of the last week, I noticed that the rate of price increase in Russia was 0.02%, which is minimal. Again, one shouldn't read too much into 1 week's figures. But I suspect that the period of high inflation in Russia that we saw as a result of the overheating that took place in the summer, which we discussed on the Duran at the time, and which I discussed extensively in my various programs at the time, that the inflation and the period of overheating is now well and truly over. And my guess is that later this month, perhaps at the next meeting of the Russian Central Bank, on Friday the 25th of this month, interest rates will begin to be cut, and we will be seeing further cuts in interest rates in the autumn. The Economics Ministry is saying that whilst they're sticking to their projection that inflation this year, overall inflation this year, is going to be 7.6%, they are now preparing to revise that down, and that they are now starting to consider the possibility that inflation could fall, annualized inflation for the whole year, in other words, could fall below 7%. We are unlikely to get high growth this year, but with inflation down, with interest rates down, we will probably start to see higher growth next year, though the government in Russia also appears to be consolidating its budget at the moment, and that will also act as a brake on growth. But anyway, the period of very, very high inflation, I say very high inflation, not by Russian standards, 10% inflation in Russia is not actually especially high. In the 2000s, in the first decade of Putin's rule, in other words, 10% inflation was about average in any particular year, just saying. After 2012, it began to fall into single figures. Sometimes it's fallen as low as 2% in any one year, but that's unusual. But anyway, I think the very high inflation, the relatively high inflation we've seen over the last year, is now definitely coming to an end. This, in my opinion, is by far the biggest topic of discussion in Russia at the moment. They are obviously keeping careful track of the military situation. People are involved and engaged in the war. But I think the general sentiment in Russia is that the war has essentially been won. It will eventually be brought to a victorious outcome. But I don't actually get the sense that there's much demand in Russia at the present time, at least not from the people who matter, to intensify and accelerate military operations. I know that there are other views, and obviously the more hardline people would like to see things taken faster. But I think most people have been thinking more about the economy recently and the interest rates than the military situation. And if we're talking about the sanctions, the tariffs, I think the reason they're not fazed by them, they're not worried about them, is because the European Union sanctions are seen as ridiculous and lacking all point and meaning. And I think they also don't believe that the 100% tariffs against China and India are going to be imposed. And if they are imposed, they don't think that that's going to cause China and India to waver from their trade relationship, their long established and secure trade relationship with Russia. So I think that's the general mood in Moscow at the present time. Now, there's been some rather interesting developments on the dirty war side of things. The first is that we've now had more information from the London Times about Colonel Veronic, the SBU official who was assassinated. The Ukrainians insist at Russian instigation in Kiev a short time ago, about a week ago. And according to the London Times, Veronic also played a role in organising the destruction, the sabotage of the Nord Stream pipelines. Well, of course, that ultimately depends on whether you go along with the theory that it was the Ukrainians who destroyed the pipelines. But anyway, if it was, according to the London Times, it was Colonel Veronic who was apparently a key planner and organizer of that attack. And one detail has come to light about his assassination, which I was not aware of. This is that the Ukrainians claim that they killed the two people, a couple, a man and a woman, who were the hit squad that actually assassinated Colonel Veronic. Now, they've never provided us with many details about these two people, and they've never shown us pictures of them. And as I said, there's a lack of information generally about them. Many people I know are deeply skeptical about whether these two unfortunate people really were Colonel Veronic's assassins at all. After all, we do have only the Ukrainians claim that they were. And, I have said in my previous program, where I've discussed this, that I'm going to go along with the Ukrainian version of events because I've no information that contradicts it. I don't definitely know that it is true, but I'm going to go along with it until some other theory as to how he might have been assassinated comes to light. But there was one interesting detail about these two people who were killed, which is that they turn out to have been Azerbaijanians. Apparently they were both of Azerbaijani ethnicity. They were not Ukrainians, and they were not ethnic Russians. Now, I've discussed Azerbaijan in recent programs. The recent deterioration in relations between Azerbaijan and Russia, the fact that the Russians are busy clearing up various organized crime networks linked to Azerbaijan across the territory of Russia. I've mentioned how the Russian strikes on the two oil refineries in Ukraine appear to have been a signal to Azerbaijan as well, because it was Azerbaijanians who apparently owned big stakes in these two refineries. Now, it looks as if over the last week or so, Azerbaijan and Russia have been quietly working to try to stabilize the relationship between the two of them. There's been much less news about a further deterioration in the relationship between the two, and it looks as if that process, for the moment at least, has come to an end. But it does look as if Azerbaijan is at the center of many different threads, and it is intriguing that these two individuals are now being linked by Ukraine to Azerbaijan, with the Ukrainians claiming that they were working for the Russians. Just saying. Now, on this topic, there's been a very interesting piece of information about Azerbaijan and its exact role in various recent events, which has appeared on Larry Johnson's blog, Sona 21, and it reproduces Larry Johnson has reproduced information that he was provided by one of his viewers, which says that in fact Azerbaijan has been working to improve relations with Iran, that they recently agreed to a new ambassador, a new Iranian ambassador, and that of course Pezeshkian himself has recently visited Azerbaijan, and that Azerbaijan categorically denies that it had any role at all in the Israeli attack on Iran. And this person who's been in contact with Larry Johnson is saying that what most likely happened is that the Israeli aircraft that struck at Iran from the north actually were operating from airstrips in Iraqi Kurdistan. The Kurds in Iran are closely allied, or some of them are, not all of them, are closely allied to Israel. And there have been many rumors that Israel has established bases in Iraqi Kurdistan. And these aircraft flew north through Iraqi airspace and crossed into Iran. They skirted the Iranian border, launched their attacks across northern Iran, and it was whilst they were conducting their maneuvers that they dropped their drop tanks into the Caspian Sea, so that they were not operating, in other words, from Azerbaijan at all. Now that is perfectly plausible to me. It is fully consistent with the very complicated politics of this region. I don't, of course, know for a fact that this is so, but it does look as if there are many, many threads, as I said, and complex things going on relating to Azerbaijan and Iran, and Azerbaijan and Russia. Now, speaking of Russia, Putin himself has had another telephone conversation with Erdogan. They've discussed the situation in the Middle East and in Ukraine. They've also discussed the situation in Syria. They both agreed that the Israeli incursions into Syria are wrong. My sense is that this call was a call that Erdogan made to Putin, trying to enlist Putin's support to restrain the Israelis in Syria and to perhaps get Russian support, the Russians to provide some support to President al-Shara's government, so-called government in Syria. If this is true, then events have turned full circle. The Russians went in fighting al-Shara and supporting Bashar al-Assad, with the Turks backing al-Shara. The Turks were not happy with the Russians going in to support Assad. Now, apparently, the Turks are asking the Russians to support al-Shara against their former allies, the Israelis, who also played undoubtedly, unquestionably, a role in Assad's fall. Again, this tells us a great deal, perhaps about the situation in the Middle East, but it doesn't tell us very much, ultimately, about what is going to happen in Syria itself. The other big player, Iran, has, however, made its stance concerning relations with the United States absolutely clear. Now, an Iranian official has been speaking, as an anonymous official, has been speaking to Iranian media, and he's setting out conditions for a resumption of dialogue with the United States that are completely impossible. I read this. The official, who requested anonymity, stressed that any negotiations must be consistent with the security realities of the region. For now, we think the purpose of the negotiations is to disarm Iran, to make up for Israel's weakness in the next war. Our intelligence indicates Washington seeks talks to prepare for war, not peace. If so, we see no reason to waste time and would rather focus on preparing for the conflict. Any new round of negotiations must include serious and practical guarantees to ensure the process is not a cover for security deception. And then we're told that no one in the region will accept the disarmament of the region while such a regime as the Israeli becomes more armed every day. Credible punishment of Israel and compensation to Iran are other conditions for negotiations. Otherwise, negotiations will once again be a prelude to war. This is a problem for the United States, and we do not know how they intend to solve it. We must receive guarantees that Mr. Witkoff is a mediator for a solution, not a fire starter for war. Proving such guarantees is very difficult, but we are ready to give one more chance and listen to what the United States has to say on this matter and see its practical actions in this regard. Well, I don't know who this official is. My guess is it's possibly Arakshi, the foreign minister. But consider what is being demanded here. Punishment of Israel, compensation paid to Iran. That, as a minimum, in terms of guarantees provided to Iran, that future negotiations are not a trap to trick Iran ahead of a future conflict. Iran, in the meantime, preparing for the next round of the war. Well, if this is the Iranian stance, then obviously there cannot be further negotiations and another conflict between Israel and Iran and the United States looks to me inevitable, and it appears as if the Iranians expect it. I spoke earlier in the program about the resource crisis that the United States is facing, and here we see a further twist. Well, this is where I finish today's program. There'll be more from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribe Star and by going to our shop. Links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.